My name is Adorable. I'm 63 years old, and I still live in Lagoa Seca, a forgotten village in the interior of Pernambuco. Many people have left these lands, but I stayed. Those who are born here feel the earth pulling them, like invisible roots holding their souls. Or maybe it's fear, the fear that if we leave, what happened in the past might find us somewhere else. The elders talk about many ghosts, about visions that haunt the mud huts, about screams that cut through the night like razors. But nothing compares to what my family experienced in 1950, when my grandfather, SCU Juvencio, faced something that no one should ever have seen. Back then, Lagoa Seca was a handful of small mud houses surrounded by thick forest. The night was pitch black, cut only by the flickering street lamp. People went to bed early and locked their doors with thick pieces of wood. But it was no use. Not when he came. The first sign was always the same. The dogs would get all worked up, barking at nothing. The cows would get agitated in the corral, as if they sensed what was coming. Then silence, a deep, suffocating silence. And then the howls. These weren't ordinary howls. They weren't from dogs or wolves. Wolves don't even exist in these parts. They were cries of suffering mixed with ferocious growl, something that made the blood run cold. At that time, my grandfather raised cattle and worked on a farm with my father, Zika, and his brother, Chow. They were brave men, accustomed to the harshness of the land. But when the screams began to tear through the nights, not even they had the courage to leave the house. Fear became part of the routine. The town was cornered. During the day, they would find huge footprints on the dry ground, as if a giant animal had walked there. The strangest thing? The marks appeared in the middle of the yard and disappeared aimlessly, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. That was when the worst began. Chickens were found torn apart in the yards. Cows woke up with their eyes wide open and their skin torn, as if some had fed on them without mercy. Until one moonless dawn, the werewolf attacked a person for the first time. And it was my Uncle Chow. That night, Chow was the only one who had the courage to go out. He had always been stubborn. He said that werewolves were only for scared people. When the dog started barking desperately, my grandfather locked the door and said that no one would leave. But Chow laughed, grabbed a shotgun, and went out to see what was wrong. My father tried to hold him back, but Chow pushed him away and went anyway. That was the last time we saw him alive. Minutes later, we heard a bone-chilling scream. A scream that wasn't human, but wasn't that of an animal either. It was like someone was being ripped alive. My grandfather tried to open the door, but my grandmother, Dona Candinia, held his arm tightly. "Don't go, Juvencio. If you go, he'll take you too." They all stood there, silent, holding their breath. Chow's screams grew quieter, until all they could hear was the wind. My father cried softly. My grandfather held the knife handle so tightly that his hand shook. They only opened the door when the sun was already high in the sky. They found Chow lying in the middle of the dirt road, all torn up with his face turned to the sky and his eyes bulging, as if he had seen hell itself. His body was dry, as if all the blood had been sucked out. But the scariest part came later. The village priest, S.U. Clemente, ordered him to be buried immediately, saying that it was not natural. But when they went to cover the body with the shroud, they saw something on his chest, a bite mark right in the middle, large and deep, as if it had been from a giant dog. The town panicked. My grandfather decided that this had to end. That same night, he called my father and other men to stand guard. They hid behind the corral, each with a shotgun, waiting for the thing to return. And it did. It was midnight sharp when a monstrous howl echoed through the woods. The horses reared, the dogs whimpered, and a rotten smell of old meat filled the air. That was when it appeared. It was a horrible monster, its body covered in thick hair, legs crooked like a goat's, and yellow eyes that glowed in the dark. It walked on two legs, but when it moved forward, it crouched down like a predator about to attack. My grandfather aimed right at the chest and fired. The monster screamed, fell to its knees, writhed on the ground, and then ran away, limping into the woods. My grandfather tried to go after it, but Father Clemente grabbed his shoulder. If he was wounded, we'll find out who it is tomorrow. And they did. In the morning, they went to the village, and it was then that everyone understood the true horror of that curse. In the middle of the square, sitting on a bench, there was a pale man, sweating cold, with a hole in his chest and his shirt soaked in blood. It was Chow, but he wasn't dead anymore. No one believed him. What he saw, Chow, who had been buried the day before, was sitting there alive, but with his clothes torn and an open wound in his chest, in the same place where the werewolf had been shot. My father fell to his knees, his face pale with fear. My grandfather, with the shotgun on his back, took a hesitant step. Chow! He raised his head slowly. His eyes were sunken, greenish, no longer his own. A sour smell rose from his sweaty skin. Father, what happened to me? His voice was weak, but full of suffering. Father Clemente made the sign of the cross. Everyone knew what that meant. My God, my grandmother whispered, clutching a rosary tightly. Chow was cursed. He was a werewolf now. That same afternoon, the priest called the oldest men in the village. They discussed what to do, but no one wanted to say the obvious. No one wanted to be the first to suggest the unthinkable. But Chow's look betrayed it. He knew what needed to be done. I don't want to become that again, he said, tears streaming down his face. The priest approached and placed a hand on his head. Son, the only way to end the curse is with silver. Night came quickly. Chow was taken to the chapel, where he said goodbye to everyone. He asked that his body be burned so that the curse would die with him. My grandfather, with tears in his eyes, prepared the shotgun with a silver bullet that Father Clemente had blessed. A little before midnight, Chow knelt in the yard, looking up at the starry sky. Forgive me, Father. My grandfather placed a shotgun against his chest. He didn't have the courage to look his son in the eye. The shot echoed throughout Lagoa Seca. Chow fell backwards, his body rigid. But before he died, he smiled. A smile of relief. His body was burned that same morning, and the curse never returned. Or at least that's what we believed for a long time. Now, let me tell you why I still live here. Many years passed, and my grandfather died without ever speaking about that night again. But there is something that has always tormented me. The week before Chow died, he was with my mother. She never spoke about it, but a month later, she discovered she was pregnant. They were just dating. My mother raised me alone. But on a full moon night, we hear howls in the distance. Where is the werewolf that killed my father, or his descendants? My name is Pedro Lins, and since I was born, I have carried a story that my family has tried to bury, but curses are not buried. They live in the blood, hidden, waiting for the right moment to manifest themselves. My great-grandfather, Colonel Honorio Lins, was the richest man in the region, owner of lands as far as the eye can see. He ruled Lagoa Branca like a king, a tough man of firm words. He enforced his will without hesitation. But if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that even the powerful should fear certain things. The witch, for example, her name was Dona Mirtez. No one knew for sure how old she was. Some saw her as a bent old woman, with skin as wrinkled as the bark of Jatoba tree. Others swore they had met her near the river, a young woman with black hair and skin as smooth as porcelain. She lived on a piece of land that once belonged to her ancestors. Small and isolated, her cabin was surrounded by strange herbs and symbols carved into the trees. No one dared enter there until my great-grandfather decided that the land should be his. He sent men to tear down the cabin. He sent her away as if she were an animal with no right to reply. But before leaving, Dona Mirtez looked in the eye and smiled. Well then, Colonel Honorio, if my land is no longer mine, your family will also cease to be yours. They say that night she was seen to crossroads, singing in a language that no one knew. And then the misfortune began. The animals in the corral began to die out of nowhere. The horses went crazy for no reason, throwing themselves against the fence. And worst of all, my grandfather, Elias, the colonel's oldest son, began to change. On the first full moon after Dona Mirtez was expelled, something happened. Elias disappeared in the middle of the night. When the sun rose, the corral was bathed in blood, and the body of an ox was found torn apart. And in the middle of the mess, Elias returned naked, his feet covered in mud, his eyes sunken, frightened. No one ever spoke of it, but the truth is that the curse had begun. My grandfather never spoke of that night, but my great-grandfather, Colonel Honorio, knew the truth. Elias did not run away. He transformed. The colonel was not a man to believe in superstition, but he was not stupid either. He ordered that no one speak of the matter, but the misfortunes continued. With each full moon, someone or some animal would die. At first, it was just animals, oxen, pigs, even dogs. But then, people began to disappear. The cook of the big house was the first. She disappeared without a trace. Then, an experienced cowboy was found 3 days later, torn apart, with claw marks on his belly. It was only then that my great-grandfather admitted what was happening. He called a priest, old Clementino, who had come from far away and knew things that ordinary priests did not talk about. When he arrived at the farm, he asked to see Elias. My grandfather was pale, sick, with deep circles under his eyes. The priest sat down next to him and took his hand. Evil is in the blood. The colonel turned pale. Is there a cure? The priest sighed. The curse was made by blood and can only be broken by blood. That night, the colonel made a decision. He took his shotgun, prepared a silver bullet melted from an old family medallion, and went into his son's room. My grandfather already knew. When he saw his father standing at the door with tears in his eyes, he understood what was going to happen. Dad, I don't want to die. The colonel couldn't do it. He dropped the shotgun on the ground and hugged his son. That night, Elias ran away. He disappeared into the darkness of the forest, and he never came back. Or at least that's what they thought. Elias disappeared. My great-grandfather never saw him again, and over time, the story became a whisper within the family. But the curse, that never went away. The years passed. Colonel Honorio died without ever knowing the fate of his son, and my father was born. The farm got smaller, the city grew, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. Until I was born, ever since I was little, my mother said I was different. I dreamed of the forest, woke up screaming at the full moon, and had unusual strength for a child. When I was 12, I accidentally broke a cousin's arm while shaking hands. My father avoided the subject, but one day I heard him talking to my mother. If you're like Elias, we can't hide this forever. That night, I waited for everyone to fall asleep and went to the old trunk in my father's room. Inside, I found an old notebook. It belonged to Colonel Honorio. I leafed through the pages with my heart racing, and then I saw it. The curse was made by blood, and it can only be broken by blood. My fingers were shaking. I understood everything. I am the last descendant of the Lins, the last bearer of the curse. The way my father found to break the curse was to look for Mirtez. I think that when she found out he was looking for her, she showed up at our door, young and beautiful. My father and my mother asked her to lift the curse from the family, and they would give her back her land. She laughed in mockery and spat on the ground. She didn't want to hear it and left. I clung to God in my nocturnal deliriums. Dona Mirtez, the witch, was found dead in the town square. A few days later, on a hot morning, her head was ripped from her body. But who would do that? With that, the curse that hung over me ended. I never had those episodes again, and today I am a normal young man. Could have been my great-uncle Elias,